the other thing that I was concerned about, if people are inclined to hurt helpless animals, who is the next most available helpless target? And that would be little children. That's the danger. It might be repugnant that someone pokes the eyes out of a cat or sets it on fire, but it's terrifying when it goes to the next level.
Welcome to Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. My name's Mark Savic. I'm the Principal of Guardian Criminal Law, and we'll be bringing you podcasts weekly. A variety of topics that can be very sensitive, so please be careful when you're listening, and if you need any assistance at all, we'll include a lifeline number at the bottom of the page. We really appreciate you subscribing and liking our podcast channel. You can listen to us across most social media platforms, Spotify, YouTube, TikTok, and you'll find us there. We look forward to bringing you many episodes in the future. Right, so today we've got Miss Jenny Quinn joining us. Jenny, you're thoroughbred horse trainer and strapper, a JP, and a lawyer.
That's right.
That's amazing.
Thank you.
Tell us a little bit about your journey to the law.
Well, probably as a child, I always had a bit of a sense of right and wrong and didn't like being bullied or any of that. And I thought, didn't see myself going that way, probably more a veterinary surgeon actually when I was younger. I didn't have much to do with humans, an awful lot to do with animals. I've changed my mind now. I really do feel quite sorry for humans, and so I'm enjoying this side of my life now where I have more to do with them. And so I think as a child at school, I had quite good marks going forward, but a slight glitch at the age of 15 where I managed to get pregnant and have a child.
Yeah,
so
wow.
Lisa was cared for by myself and my parents. She's now married with her own children.
You stayed at school?
No, in those days we couldn't do that.
Yeah,
no.
that would have been a real issue.
It was terrible. Yep,
Okay.
really bad. And so, yes, that was the end of school for me. So I had to learn how to type. I'd been at school learning Latin and other things like that. And so I learned to type. I got office jobs, worked in bars and nightclubs and anything I could do, but always paying for my child to go to school. And then eventually, as time went on, you could actually go back to school. And I recall going to get my university entrance when I was about 20, and then I couldn't make my mind up whether to do pharmacy. And then I married and had 2 more children. I worked in a business, and we lived on a small farm. That's where I started breeding the horses. So, yes, I eventually started studying law at that age.
You did some agricultural studies too.
I did. I started off with agricultural science. I didn't
Okay.
finish that one, but I enjoyed it. I lived in Palmerston North in New Zealand, so Massey University, the agricultural college or university was there.
Okay.
Yeah. So
And sorry, I've taken you off track. And so then you commenced your studies in law.
I didn't. In New Zealand, I lived in a rural area, so the closest university to me was Victoria, and it's a lovely old university. I really wanted to do a law degree there, but I started in Australia at Bond. My parents departed and left us behind and came to Redcliffe in Australia, probably about 1990.
Okay. How old were you then?
So I would have been about probably in my 30s then.
Okay.
And
So it wasn't like they were abandoning their children.
no, they escaped and they enjoyed it over here.
Okay.
Yeah. So I came along after my marriage broke up. I then came over here in 2000 and enrolled pretty much straight away at Bond University. And I started studying law there, and I loved every minute of it.
In one of our previous episodes, we had the pleasure of talking to Dr. Gavin Polk. You've done work with Dr.
Yes.
Polk recently, currently working with Dr. Polk as
That's
I am.
right.
And the topic of our conversation sort of touched on psychopathy and the signs of psychopathy. And I asked a question of Dr. Polk about what sort of early signs there are with children. And he talked about lack of eye contact was a big one that he talked about, and we had some discussion around that. And then he also talked about this propensity to be cruel to animals and not have any empathy. You've done some work around that.
I did.
Can you talk to us a little bit about your findings?
Look, as a child, I had really strong feelings about hurting animals or loathing for that kind of thing. Why would anyone do that?
Yeah.
So at university, there was a new subject that came along, animal law. And I enrolled in it thinking with my farming background I'd learn about contracts for exporting live sheep. People are not happy about that.
Okay.
And in fact, it was more to do with the legislation that deemed animals were not sentient. They had no feelings and they didn't love, they didn't feel pain, which of course I believe is not true.
I agree with you.
And, you know, as I don't
I think anybody that's owned animals would have to agree with you, wouldn't they?
Yeah.
Wouldn't they have? It's just you can see the purpose in them and the emotion in them, and you interact with them. For anybody to say that they don't communicate with you, that's just not correct.
No, well, we even find with family law matters sometimes people are fighting over the dog as it's their child, but the law says it's property.
And unfortunately, in some domestic violence matters, we're having people being cruel to animals in order to hurt the other party.
That's quite right. Yeah. And so now that time has gone on a bit, we've got not only do society accept that these animals feel, but they're just so useful. And you have the canine assistance dogs for medical purposes. Of course, police dogs and seeing eye dogs have been around for a long time. But today, the emotional support dogs for sufferers of PTSD, in my case, riding for the disabled has been around forever, where you have children that are disabled or shy, and they thrive on their interaction with animals. Yeah, so I started wondering, I'm quite interested in criminal law, and I wondered if people who started off hurting animals as young children, it is unusual. I don't want everyone to think that it goes on all the time. It's not that common, but there are people or small children that seem to enjoy doing it. They seem to be obsessed with it. And is this a problem? You know, do they go on hurting them, and then when they run out of animals, do they turn to other small children, and does it develop into anything else? And as your discussion with Dr. Polk indicated, I believe it's called the McDonald triad. I don't know if it's been still as popular as it was back in the day, but in 1963, psychiatrist John McDonald, he decided this McDonald triad was very relevant, and that would be as a predictor of adult violence, and that would be fire setting, bedwetting beyond the age of 5, and cruelty to animals. I found it very difficult to research this topic for the simple fact that anything, as we know, to do with children is not for production.
That's right.
Not, the closed courts, and they often use an initial as opposed to a name, and that's not a bad thing, of course, but it's even the case many years ago of the murder of that little boy, James Bolger, in
that was in England.
The UK, yep.
Tell us a little bit about that case.
Look, I don't have too much by way of details, the date and whatever. It's a long time ago. But 2 boys, I think they were aged about 10 or 11, took a little boy who was 2, James Bolger. His mother had him by the hand in a shopping centre and just let go momentarily. And much to her horror, he was gone. And these boys took him away. And they terribly mutilated and hurt him, bashing him with bricks and kicking him and hurting him, putting paint on him. I believe they put batteries in his mouth. It was just dreadful. And after that, they took him and they lay him across railway tracks. And I understand that they had been doing that to animals earlier. And laying them across the railway tracks and observing them being sort of cut in half by the trains. And that's exactly what happened to little James Bolger. His body was found 2 days later, and the trains had been over the top of him as well. So that was shocking. And
what sort of sentences did those two boys receive?
Look, from memory, I think around 8 years, and it was extended. They were sent to 2 different residences, if you will, more like a boys' home scenario, not so much a prison. There were arguments back then about whether children had the capacity to understand if they'd done wrong beyond the age of 10. And these boys, it was deemed that they did know that it was wrong. In the case of one of the boys, he went on to not reoffend for the rest of his life. But from memory, the boy, might have been Venables, he went on to become very interested in child pornography. And he was found repeatedly with child pornography, and he was incarcerated on a number of occasions. The problem they had with both of them was keeping their names, or they suppressed the names, but then they gave them other identities, if you will. And every now and again, someone would find out. And as Facebook came along, they were putting things on Facebook. These people were being punished for doing that as well, by outing these guys for the risk that it may not have been them. So there was some mention that maybe Venables had come to New Zealand or Australia.
Yes, that's what I heard. That's what I was just about to mention. It was just Venables, was it?
I think so, yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
I seem to remember some discussion about where they were going to go upon release.
Yeah.
Because they wouldn't be able to live a normal life.
No. Well, clearly Venables really, he didn't become a model citizen at all after that. I don't know if he's still alive. He's clearly hidden away somewhere.
Do we know much about their family life?
From what I gather, they were troubled. The other boy, look, I'm not sure if his name was Thompson. I can't remember. He was initially the perpetrator, and he was the one that wanted to hurt the child. But as time went on, they both suffered from post-traumatic stress, and the boy that initially wanted to be the cruelest suffered the worst, and he never went on to offend again. So it's very difficult. I haven't looked thoroughly into it, and yeah, it can be difficult to find out too much, but I don't know whether someone's childhood is necessarily a precursor. It's no doubt going to influence the way that a young person grows up if they don't have that caring parental support, and someone that's going to maybe point out that poking the eyes out of Pussycat is not appropriate. If they see dreadful behaviour at home, no doubt they're going to carry that with them, but does it make them kill other people? And interestingly, my mother was born in Glasgow. She was evacuated from Glasgow during the Second World War and thought she'd died and gone to heaven. Glasgow is not a pleasant location, and her mother ran away when she was only 5 and left her in a house full of men, so I have no idea what happened to my mother. But she's an interesting person. She's no longer with us. She believed that if you were allowed some form of pity for murder, she would be a mass murderer, because her background was so appalling that everyone would have felt so sorry for her. However, she always believed that everybody knows right from wrong. And she knew right from wrong when she was a small child. And interestingly, without knowing right from wrong, she would have had no hope. And that hope is what people that come from those dreadful backgrounds pray for, that a kind person will come along and help them. And sadly, that often doesn't happen.
Well, if you're born with a predisposition towards that sort of behaviour, and then you're born into that environment.
That's right.
Then those things coupled together don't give much hope for a good outcome.
No. And there's not that sense of empathy either, because no one's ever shown it to you. Yeah. So no, you can look at quite a few serial killers actually, and invariably they have a disposition to hurt animals.
I'd like to have a discussion with you about the state of the law. So we're talking about animals being recognised as sentient beings.
Mm-hmm.
I do know that India passed laws a few years ago recognising dolphins as sentient non-humans.
Okay.
And so this idea of recognising animals as sentient beings is starting now to appear in some of our legislation. Can you tell us a little bit about that sort of development? So what sort of rights animals have and the foundation upon which those rights are assessed?
Most farm animals are just they're dealt with by way of legislation, and generally the 5 freedoms are what would apply normally to a farm animal. So that would be the right to be able to stand up and lie down, turn around and groom themselves, and just stretch their limbs. So if they're being transported from A to B, live sheep and cattle export, these types of things, they would be the basis on which the people transporting would be sort of regulated or prosecuted if the animals are not entitled to these 5 freedoms. But I really don't have up-to-date information on that.
So I wonder how they consider pets. What sort of rights do pets have under the law?
As I understand it, they're still property. So we have these organisations like the RSPCA and Animal Welfare League, many of whom people that volunteer for these out and about in society. They look for funding from the public at large, and they will go out and collect these animals that they believe are being injured and hurt, and then retrain them and put them back into society to be adopted again. They're reliant on people complaining and ringing in. Organisations like greyhound racing and thoroughbred racing, those industries have their own monitoring situation where the people who have the licences are obliged to treat the animals accordingly. There have been recent incidences where there have been some dreadful situations occurring, especially with greyhounds.
Yes, we saw that horrific footage of greyhounds being trained with live bait animals.
That's correct, yeah.
So the people that are tying the bait animal to that machine that spins them around the track, they're not the same as the psychopaths, are they?
No.
They don't have any empathy for the animal that they're tying on to be bait, but it's coming out of a desire for commercial gain.
That's correct.
They want the animal to win, the dog to win the race, so that they can get some money, and the cruelty to the rabbit or to the baby pig that they tie onto this machine is just part and parcel of the pursuit of the win. So it's different than just inflicting pain and suffering upon an animal just for the sake of enjoying the pain and suffering.
I agree with you. And we also have to look beyond that to the farming background where not that long ago, I mean, even young boys were sent out to kill a sheep and chickens for the family to feed. They knew how to kill them and how to skin them, how to cut them up. And today, with everything being packaged, people don't really remember those days. So with the commercial baiting for the dogs, allowing them to kill does actually make them chase the prey. That's been a practice for many generations with these greyhounds and wolfhounds and other dogs that are gaze hounds. So there are other pursuits like the fox hunting, for example, that's now been banned in the UK. So the poor fox, he was very difficult to catch actually, but the hounds would chase him down and then they'd catch him. They would disembowel the fox, ripping him up, and then if I was a fresh rider on that hunt, I would be blooded. So the intestines or parts of the fox would be just rubbed across my face and leave a piece of sort of a bit of gore, and that was my introduction to being part of the hunt club.
Yeah, so that's animal cruelty, at its highest, really.
It's a sort of a tradition,
yes.
And I'm quite pleased it's no longer around.
Yeah.
They do hunt in New Zealand. There are no foxes. They hunt hares, so they still do that. On the other hand, they've got a really bad rabbit problem over there. So if they're not poisoning them and they're managing to hunt one or two with their groups of horses chasing them, that's all well and good. But they do get, if the pack of hounds get hold of the prey, they do rip it apart. There's no doubt about that. It's just something that I don't feel comfortable about myself. No.
Yeah. Yeah, not at all.
No.
That's very different to young people being directly cruel to animals. I can recall a couple of cases when I was much younger where some children had set fire to a horse in a paddock.
Good God.
And another case where they'd set fire to a cat.
Yeah.
And then let the cat go.
Yeah.
So they're very concerning sorts of incidents.
Well, this is with children, they can be curious, and if that's combined with this clinical stand back and observe lack of empathy personality, I could almost see them disemboweling a creature and pegging it out like Jeffrey Dahmer did, and observing it, still alive but dying, as a sort of classroom experiment, for want of a better term.
So Dahmer was doing that sort of stuff as a kid, was he?
Yes.
Okay, so tell us a bit about who Jeffrey Dahmer was. I know a lot of people will still remember, but there will be a lot of younger listeners and viewers who would not know about Mr. Dahmer. So,
look, I've got a note here. There was a recent program on television that was quite interesting, and he spoke about everything himself. He's quite conversational. He apparently dismembered 17 boys and men. So he
cannibalised some too, didn't he?
He did, yes. So he dismembered and killed animals when he was a young boy.
Okay.
He did hunting. I believe his father enjoyed hunting as well. From what I gather, he didn't come from a poor, a sort of an unfortunate background. He seemed to be quite doted upon by his parents. He lived with his grandmother for quite a while. However, the prey that he was, the human beings that were being dismembered and stored underneath her home, the odour became so bad that she asked him to leave.
Oh, so what did she think it was him?
I don't think she had any idea they were human beings that he dismembered and was in love with. So the unfortunate thing about him is that he truly did fall in love with people. Presumably he had some psychological problem where he couldn't interreact with living people. So he would he wasn't violent in the way he killed them, to my knowledge. I think he poisoned. He gave them sedatives.
Yes, he drugged them first,
and then
it would get very violent.
Oh,
sadistic maybe.
Is that right? Oh, okay.
I think one of the victims. I think one of the victims that was not long before he was apprehended. There was a young man who he had enticed back to his apartment. He had drugged.
Yeah.
And then he drilled a hole in his head and poured acid into the hole to try to effect a chemical lobotomy.
Okay.
And he thought that he would be able to control the person this way, so that once he damaged that part of that frontal lobe, that they would become like a zombie and forever under his control, and he could then keep them in his apartment to use as he desired.
His loved one.
So this seemed to be some part of his pattern of behaviour. He would get somebody, but the thought of letting them go was just too much.
That's right.
Couldn't let them go. So, and this is why they say that he kept their body parts, because he had to hang on to them. Like, instead of disposing of them somewhere far away, he wanted them to be close by, even though they were dead. It's one of the most disturbing parts about Dahmer's case is that this young man escaped and he ran out into the street, And neighbours called the police and said there's a young man in huge distress out in the street. The police came. Dharma came downstairs and said to the police that was his gay lover and that he'd been drinking too much and taking drugs and he's been trying to look after him because he's the way he is. And the police let him take him back up to the apartment and the police left. And that young man was then killed.
Yep.
Yeah. So it's just absolutely frightening stuff that he would have the temerity that he's inflicted this torture upon somebody and brain damage, and he's gone down and faced the police, obviously with a lot of confidence, to be able to convince them.
Took him away.
Yeah.
I understand he spent a bit of time in prison. He released might have been a juvenile at one point. He'd let him go, and they caught him for that. And so that was one of his mistakes. I don't know that he made that mistake too much again by leaving them alive.
That's right. But
there
was also, I coming back to home, closer to home, Ivan Milat, the backpacker killer, I think that he was also one where there was a link to cruelty to animals from a young age.
Yes, So he was a backpacker murderer. That's what he was known as. He was convicted of murdering seven missing young people. They believe there could have been more. But yes, he tortured animals and shot them, and he was apparently quite a cruel person. He did come from a very disturbed family background.
What was his family background like?
So, look, some of the brothers in the family seem to be quite lucid and as fairly sensible, actually. I've seen them on television. I don't know much more about it. It was quite a troubled background, quite harsh. And, so he was definitely, I would suggest, a troubled person long before he started murdering other people. And once again, there seems to be a similarity with some of these people. They just have trouble reaching out to another person and having a normal relationship, being able to discuss things with them. It's almost as if they have to take possession and render this person either unconscious or dead before they can have a relationship with them at all. So this is quite common. And also we have Martin Bryant, of course.
Yes.
Now, he was obviously the Tasmanian mass murderer, 35 people killed.
What year was that now, Jenny? I can't remember. Was that back in the 80s or 90s?
It was, John Howard was
Prime Minister.
So that legislation preventing guns could well have caused, prevented far more of these mass murderings. So no, I don't have the date for that. But he was referred to mental health officials when he was 7 years old, and again when he was 11 for torturing and harassing animals.
Do you know any of the details of that behaviour?
Not so much that behaviour, but he was once again quite doted upon by his parents, as I understand it. And
he clearly had some mental health issues.
Oh yes, I believe he had an extremely low IQ,
right,
and he could get quite frustrated, be difficult to deal with. He ended up forming a relationship with an older woman who was quite wealthy. I believe she was the heiress to the Tattersalls empire, and he moved in with her. And I would say today you might deem it he was her carer, but yes, so that was what happened to him when he left his family. His father ended up dying. But he was, I think, doted on, really, as I understand it. And, so the signs would have been there with the torturing of animals and just his general demeanour. And he didn't come from the same background as Milat at all. So this is where it makes it difficult to guess where these people are going to come from next. But the torturing of animals is certainly a precursor for some serious mental health issue going forward, and lack of empathy.
So lack of empathy. So lack of empathy for life in general.
I think that...
Is it a need to also exercise control?
Yes, yeah.
Over life?
I think it must be, because you've got... the other thing that I was concerned about, if people are inclined to hurt helpless animals, who is the next most available helpless target? And that would be little children. Yeah. So you've got infants and babies and toddlers. They can't tell anybody what's happened to them. And that's the danger. It might be repugnant that someone pokes the eyes out of a cat or sets it on fire, but it's terrifying when it goes to the next level. And they may be luring little ones away, like with little Bulger Boy. I mean, that was something that was broadcast all over the world. But how many times does this occur that we don't know of? Maybe it's not that bad, but it shouldn't be happening at all.
No, it shouldn't be happening at all. No. I had a case several years ago it was in New South Wales, and there was a young boy. He didn't do very well at school. He didn't make friends easily.
No.
He was quite a shy young fellow. And he come from a very religious family, and I think they were like Mormons or one of those sort of groups, Mormons, Seventh-day Adventists type of groups that have a sort of cultish sort of bent. And his relationship with people outside of that circle was, there wasn't much of it. He didn't have many connections outside of it. But he then started working, and he got work in a supermarket, just doing general sort of counter duties and checkout duties at a supermarket. And he fell into some friendships. And there was, I think, one female and two males. Mm-hmm. They were just a little bit older than him. He was in his mid-teens. He's just being able to start to work about that 15 years of age. And they were driving, so they were in like 16, 17 years of age, or 17, 18 years of age, but they had driver's licenses. And they started asking him to accompany them on outings. And his parents became really happy that he had some friends coming around, picking him up, and he was becoming more outgoing. So they saw it as a big positive in their child's life. And all the time, they had just been grooming him.
Oh, no.
And they'd been grooming him to practice stabbing something alive.
Oh.
And it was the girl who was the ringleader who had arranged it all. So they got him feeling very comfortable with their friendship, and they pretended like he was their friend. One afternoon, they pick him up and they take him to a remote site where there's a bit of a reserve there. There was an outbuilding of some kind there as well, I believe. And the girl pulled out a knife, stabbed him several times, then passed the knife to one of the boys and said, "Go ahead, have a go. It feels just like when we were stabbing the chicken."
Oh, no.
So they'd obviously savagely attacked and, killed a chicken.
They've been practicing.
Yes, so they've been finding some sort of pleasure. This group of 3 young adults who had done these things, and then the third boy, he also stabbed him a couple of times. So she stabbed him several times. The boys stabbed him a couple of times, and they just left him there.
Did he die?
And they left him there. He said that he was unconscious for a period. Maybe it was the shock of what was happening. Don't know.
No.
But he came to, and he saw a light, and he just walked towards the light. And it was a farmhouse, and it was some distance away. So luckily they, through their total lack of experience, I would suggest, their lack of knowledge of human anatomy, they've stabbed him in such a way that they haven't damaged his vital organs.
No.
So he's managed to make it there, and yes, he survived. The damage to him, though, and to his family, that loss in faith in other humans, that'll just never be recovered. He probably is going to suffer from PTSD for the rest of his life. How is he meant to make meaningful relationships? But it was interesting to see that those three had started with animals. So they'd started animals and then made a transition to a person, to a victim. I'm not sure what the driver was for them to do that. So this was a case that I know of, and spoke to people that were involved. I spoke to family members, but it wasn't a case that I had the courage of. So I still don't know how that ended up.
There
at
is
the end
that
of the day.
crossover. One of the John Raymond Travers that I remember finding out.
And that was the Anita Cobby?
Yes.
Yep.
That was one of the most disturbing murders that I can honestly say that I...
Tell us about that. It's a murder very well known in the legal fraternity, and it was highly publicised when it occurred. I think it was back in the 70s or 80s, wasn't it? 80s?
I'm not sure of the exact dates. She was a very beautiful young woman.
Yes.
And a lovely person, I believe, training to be or was a nurse. She'd recently married, and they just spotted her, a group of young men in a car, and she was walking home, I believe, from a train station, going home after working in the city, and there were a family of a group of young males that were all part of the one family, and two other guys, the perpetrator being John Raymond Travers. He had a dreadful childhood, but he'd been known to kill and rape sheep from a very young age. He'd go and buy them, and he'd cut their throat while having sexual relations with the sheep, and then he would cut it up and they would barbecue it and eat it. So he had this kind of crossover where he was able to kill an animal for the correct purpose, to eat it, but in the meantime be involved with this sort of dreadful...
So bestiality as well.
Yep, he did. And in fact, look, I don't know if it's true, but from what I gather, that's exactly what he did to her. While he was raping her, he just held her head and cut her throat at the same time. And she wasn't discovered straight away either. So I just found...
How many of them were there? There was a few of them.
Look, I think there were three brothers. Were they Murphy? I'm not...
Yes, I think that's right.
Then there was one other guy and Travers. They didn't... I don't know that they got released from prison. Travers died in prison. I understand he had some sort of cancer or a medical situation that took his life. But that was just appalling, that particular, and he most definitely started out killing animals for sure as well. You've even got, when you talk about their background as well, from what I gather, Ted Bundy didn't have all that bad of a background. He was a notorious serial killer in the United States, quite a handsome Ted Kennedy, the sort of J.F. Kennedy, that type of person, if you will, and nicely dressed. He used to have a fake broken arm plaster on his arm. He'd go around and ask ladies, could you help me because my arm's, broken it. And he would lure them to his car that didn't have any door handles on the inside and take them away. And he'd kill them.
How many people did Bundy murder?
So, look, that's a good point. I think many that we don't know about, but I think around at least 15 or something.
Yeah, there were a lot, yeah.
He was actually married and he had a wife. I don't know that she knew what he did. But some of these guys, Dahmer and definitely Bundy, were necrophiliacs. So much as they possibly had normal relationships with women as well, or men, I don't know. In the case of Dharma, I doubt it, but their desire to have a relationship with a person would only really be effective as far as they were concerned if the person was dead.
Wow.
So that tends to be a bit of a link with the killing of animals as well. And pretty heinous murders as well. They will keep the bodies and go back to them and continue to have sexual relation with the body until it's just decomposing.
Wow.
So there are quite a few.
Have there been any serial killers in New Zealand? I can't say that I've ever heard.
Not really. I think the mosque killing was more of that was
A massacre.
A massacre, yeah. Sneaking around killing people. There have been rapists, yes. But to be fair, I think the Australian police are much more effective at catching these people. I personally kind of know that if anything happens here, it's only a matter of time before the Australian police will get them. It wasn't my feeling that way in New Zealand. There were quite a few young women who'd be abducted, and it was never discovered what happened to them over there. So maybe it's a smaller country, not as many police on the job, but they're pretty good at catching the criminals over here.
Yes, I found that too.
Yeah.
I found that too. We've talked about children being cruel to animals, and that seeming to be an early indicator of violent crime in the future.
Yes.
So what do parents do if you observe your child involved in being cruel to animals or not being considerate of animals? I suppose there's room for education, surely.
Well, there is. Sometimes the animals take the law into their own hands. So if Fluffy's being dragged around by the tail, it could be that they'll bite and scratch the child. So in a way, you've got to be very careful to protect the child from injury if they're going to provoke an animal to bite or scratch. But I always used to just point out that if you're hurting Fluffy, and imagine what it would feel like if Fluffy hurt you. It's just unfair. And teach them that they do have feel. I've always done that myself. It is difficult because certain parents have got different points of view. Some parents might think their child does no wrong and be allowed to do anything they want. And there are a lot of smaller families today without villages to raise the children. They're not the aunties and uncles and grandmothers anymore, and the children are going off to daycare.
Yeah.
And it's difficult to know who is actually teaching them. They could be the victims of bullying themselves at daycare and may not understand that it's not okay to run up and hurt someone. So it's a different world that we're living in now, actually.
Yeah, very true.
I've got just with regard to cruelty to animals and an assessment of that, children do things for different reasons. So you might have curiosity, and the animal might be killed in the process. They might have no idea that pulling the wings off flies is going to kill them, and that's just the beginning. Yeah. Peer pressure, as you were talking about earlier. Let's all get together and stab somebody and see what happens. You've got mood enhancement. Abuse might relieve boredom, and sexual gratification, the bestiality side of it. You've got attachment to an animal. So you might even have a child take the animal away, hide it away, and it might die, starve to death or whatever, to stop somebody else hurting it. Just sort of love, actually. Then you've got phobias. So there are children and humans who are afraid, for example, of birds.
Yeah.
And they might kill just to keep them away. Post-traumatic play. So they will act out maybe themselves being attacked or abused, and with the family pet, and as a result of that the animal might die being choked, this sort of thing. imitation of their parents' abuse to the animals, self-injury. So they might just maybe have a precursor to cutting themselves, and they'll experiment on the animal. They might be fascinated by the blood, this sort of thing. They can rehearse, as we were talking earlier, for our interpersonal violence that they're planning with the chickens. So they're practicing on the animal, and then they have every intention of going to the next level and hurting a human. And then finally, a vehicle for an emotional abuse. So this is what we're talking about with domestic violence, where you've got one partner will hurt the other person's dog or cat, make threats with livestock, horses, for example. Well, I'm going to send them to the dog food, this type of thing. And it can be terribly traumatic for the person that loves the pet. And it's becoming, we're noticing this with domestic violence matters quite frequently now. Yes.
Yeah. So the message out of that is that if your child is cruel to an animal, they won't necessarily become a serial killer.
No.
I'm guilty. My mother tells a story. I cannot remember the event, but my mother tells a story, so I'll accept it as being true. She said that when I was about 2 or 3 years of age, we had a cat. The cat's name was Mitzi, and I was left to my own devices for a while, and I'd decided the cat needed a haircut.
Okay.
So I got scissors and was trimming the cat's hair and accidentally cut its ear.
Oh.
And there was quite a lot of blood because it was the ear.
Mm-hmm.
And my mother said that she grabbed me by the ear and the scissors and ran the scissors across the top of my ear, but just the back side of the scissors.
Yeah, yep.
So I'd think that she was cutting off my ear. She said, I never ever did such a stupid thing again.
She's smart.
So so she's put an end to that very quickly.
And I bet you haven't done anything like that.
No, absolutely not. And I've been a hunter.
Yeah.
And I've taught my boys to hunt.
That's right.
And taught them that it's extremely serious business. It's the most serious thing you can do.
But I recall you bringing us, it might have been a goat, I can't remember one of your hunting specimens, but you'd made a delicious stew out of it.
Curry or something I would have made. Yeah, that's right.
So,
well, that's why I hunt, is just for organic meat for the table. And there's absolutely no joy in taking a life.
No.
And when you do hunt, it's inevitable that if you have a hunting career or you're involved in hunting over a long period of time, it's inevitable that accidents will happen where the animal's not dispatched cleanly.
No.
It's all sorts of things, like something getting in the way, a bullet ricocheting off something and hitting another animal that you never intended to hit at all. There's a whole range of reasons that it can go wrong.
Yeah.
With practice, that's very rare that it does go wrong. But when it goes wrong, there's an overwhelming feeling of compassion for the suffering and a responsibility that you have been the one that has inflicted the suffering, and a responsibility to put an end to that suffering as soon as possible. And the events, I can recall during the years of me hunting, I can recall 3 events. That's over many, many years. But they are very fresh in my mind. I can describe them in a lot of detail. So that is obviously an example of where animals can be hurt, lives of the animals taken, but there's no intended cruelty. There's a lot of empathy for the animal.
There's
and
an
a lot of appreciation
sense of
for
duty to find that animal. I know that a former client of mine, Aboriginal man, he was telling me he'd accidentally wounded a roo, and he trailed it for miles until he found it. He had a conflict with the owners of the property because he didn't have permission to be there. But once he explained he was going to find this animal and put it out of its misery, they were fine with that.
Yeah.
But it's making sure that there's a dignity attached when you're hunting them. But it's a completely different situation to hurting animals when you're a small child and what unfolds from that. Yeah.
Jenny, thank you very much.
Okay,
thank you
welcome.
for being with us today.
That's all right.
All right. We'll talk with you again soon.
Thank you.
Thank you very much for listening to another episode of Crime Scene Gold Coast with Guardian Criminal Law. We're enjoying bringing you these podcasts on a weekly basis, and we look forward to bringing you many more. We've got a Patreon page where you can subscribe. That'll assist us in bringing you future episodes, and also any money raised through that goes towards a youth help program that we're running. We look forward to your company for many months to come. Thank you.